Okay, so thanks ever so much for coming along today. So my name's James Richards. I'm director of Chromatrope, which is a sort of small digital innovation, creativity and development business. Every day, with a wave of our hands, we manipulate hidden fields and virtual clouds to buy or trade what we need to eat, drink, sleep and travel. What kind of arcane magic is this? Why, contactless, of course. But what would it be like if the rituals and practices of our everyday bank card transactions were more significant? What if we could design for understanding and have interactions that lead to a deeper acknowledgement of our places in personal, national and global economies? So today we're going to consider the Hermetic Bank Card. We'll think about how bank cards of all types could figure more positively and prominently in the fabric of our economic lives. And we'll explore how the form, function, identity, and meaning of the card has been shaped over time. And we'll also try and imagine their magical potential in a reimagined economy. And I think there's going to be a bit of time for questions and conversation at the end. So credit cards have been around for a long time, with the original concept described first in 1887 by Edward Bellamy in his utopian novel Looking Backward. And various coins, plates and medals were in use through the 1920s and 30s, with the charger plate, which you can see there, in use in the US from the 30s to the 50s. And these analog dog tags held a slip of paper, an actual piece of paper, with the credit status of a shopper, and they were kept in the store. So the big change really came in the 1950s with the Bank Americard and the Master Charge. These were universal systems that made credit cards and credit available to everyone. The offer of credit to everyone included mass mailouts known as drops, and these drops encompassed just about everybody, including people who'd never be able to pay back the debt that they ran up. President Johnson's special assistant, Betty Furness, described this practice that was outlawed in the 1970s as like giving sugar to diabetics. Cut to today, and they were getting on for an estimated 25 billion credit cards in use worldwide. And these little rectangles of PVC are really the ubiquitous mortar that cements the blocks of capitalism and of course so much more. So bank cards have become one of the means by which we verify our identity. We literally use a plastic card to show that we say who, to show that we're who we say we are. Cards have come to represent our legitimacy within society. They prove who we are and also that we're old enough and trusted enough to have a bank card. Being granted a bank card then is one of the contemporary rites of passage into adulthood. And by accepting a card, we're accepting liability for the debts that we incur. Bank cards authenticate us and acknowledge our role within economies as valued earners and spenders. The credit cards that validate us can easily be spoofed, of course, and used to steal our identities and our money. Criminal revenues from the data that powers our cards and identifies us is estimated to be around $100 billion a year and growing at a pretty astronomical 40% annually. And we rightly fear losing our cards, our money, and our identities. When we lose a card or have one stolen from us, we lose something of ourselves. Our economic identities embodied in super capitalist bank cards are fragile and fleeting. They appear temporary and transient and are lent to us by the banks and corporations that can easily take away what's been given. The rarest and most exclusive of credit cards are potently ostentatious physical manifestations of desire and privilege. Access to these cards is occluded. They are legendary. The story goes, in fact, that the black card that's on the screen now was dreamed into existence and born from a rumor of a card so exclusive that only 2 people in the world owned one, a card so rare that it had to exist and now does. You can't simply have enough money to apply for this card. You have to be invited into the group. This exclusive cult rewards members for their wealth and discretion. You and I will never be part of this club. An American Express Platinum card can be yours if you spend $50,000 a year. The Black Card or Centurion is by invitation only, and it's thought you need to be spending and of course paying back around $250,000 a year to qualify. Banks compete to offer the rarest and most exclusive cards. The JP Morgan Reserve card is coated in palladium. The Dubai First Royal MasterCard has a 0.235 carat diamond embedded in it and is trimmed with real gold, if you like that sort of thing. So many of these exclusive cards offer access to an around-the-clock, anywhere in the world concierge service. These services are the conjurings of jinn-like entities, invisible spirits at the end of a phone who can bring us our heart's desires. Tickets for concerts, tables for dinner, maybe even, if rumours are to be believed, company for the night. In a magical context, these cards represent wishes fulfilled, imagination embodied, and will exercised. Cards of all types have become sigils to harnessing the imaginable power of wealth and, of course, privilege. So the incantations and flourishes of our wand-like cards, watches, and fingers has brought the death of folding money and coins. Our mass contactless working is woven amidst an impossibly complex web of interrelated ecosystems, stocks and economies, artificial intelligences, and human agents, economic technicians and wizards, overt and covert manipulators, fluffers, adjusters, statisticians, forecasters, data scientists, and weirdos. Within our new economies, we've killed money in its literal, real, and traditional sense. In sacrificing money through death by 1 trillion contactless blows, we have imagined a new ephemeral economy, a virtual economy of protean algorithmic complexity and interaction. The card is one of the few remaining hooks into the real, and we cling to them in a world where the definitions of money and wealth appear to change even as we observe them. I'm thinking here, I suppose, particularly about new economic forms and blockchain. Next slide. So the magnum opus of magicians and alchemists was the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance that would turn base metals to gold and offer immortality. Our cards are truly the prima materia, the agent that transforms the valueless into gold, or indeed anything else that we might want. This image on the screen shows one of the several gold vending machines owned by the fabulously named Orient Lux company, light from the east. Wield your plastic and turn base binary into gold. Cards have then a special significance for us all. They signify our path into material society. They provide scaffolding for the necessities of contemporary consumerist culture. And cards are presented to us as both a utility and an enabler. But do we have the cards that we deserve? Are cards tools in our service, or rather is it us who serve? What if we had cards that better represented their function in our lives? What if we had a situationist style card made of stone or lead that represents the weight of our debt? What if we had a card that gradually abrades the other cards in our pockets, slyly destroying the competition? What if at the point of contactless swiping, our cards screamed in anger or cried out in shame? Curiously, with so many areas of life moving beyond recognition, the bank card has remained relatively unchanged for the last 20 years. A more likely scenario than a screaming bank card is one where the banks, which already know vast amounts about us, move decisively to make the most of the cards which they already have placed in our pockets and our lives. Our cards, rings, phones, or whatevers will act as co-pilots for life, Caliban-like spirits that know our habits, means, and limitations, and which anticipate and respond to our needs. Our rewards for being the lubricating oil of the economy may be the hyper-personalization of meals, health offers, and experiences shaped to our personalities and preferences. So as we think about a better, fairer economy and the society we want and deserve, we need to consider really the role of the bank card. We may be the oil of the economy, but our collective actions can act as a lubricant or sand in the gears of the machinery. As above, so below. So that's my little talk, which is, I guess, something of a meditation and provocation really on the role of bank cards in our lives and in our economy. And I originally gave this talk last year to the Economia conference. And it's something I'm interested in. I'm not a designer or an economist, but I'm kind of fascinated by this kind of concept of this almost magical thinking that goes on when we use cards and what those cards represent in real life compared to some very ephemeral and quite arcane complexity related to the economy that I don't begin to understand. I mean, I open the newspaper, read on screen about, the various coins, Bitcoin, Dogecoin, you name it. And it seems to me crazy. And I'm sure you all know a lot more about this area than I do, but the sort of crossover between kind of magical thinking and doing, and how the economy seems to be represented to us as consumers of it and part of it is sort of seems to be an awful lot of imagination, magical thinking and trust. And I'd love anyone's thoughts just while we've got a bit of time to have questions and a bit of a conversation really.
Well, I mean, first of all, James, I just wanted to say thank you very much. I mean, it was really interesting. I had a lot of things to think. I was thinking about as I was going through. One of them, I mean, just on a very simple note, I kind of wonder what's happening to conspicuous consumption. In the sense of kind of some of the things that you were talking about remind me of an era where it was all about, how you show, how much wealth you have, and kind of black cards and platinum cards are a little bit of that, aren't they? And I guess in a future where we don't necessarily have cards anymore, where things are rented and not bought, and where people don't are able to show their wealth in that way, what are the new ways that people are using to kind of brag, I suppose, and show off about what they have. How is that changing with digitalization, I suppose, is one sort of thought or question.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond, I thought it was really interesting recently with, it seems like there has been a growth in the number of social networks. So social networks seem to have shifted a little bit from being a kind of, access is democratic and free to various platforms. And there's been a growth in a few social networks popping up which make a real play of their exclusivity. And I wonder if that shift is significant. I wonder if actually, these kind of micro niche social networks. I mean, there is a sort of dating site, I believe, for people who are high value individuals, the wealthy, in other words. I suppose that's not necessarily a massive change from how things used to be, but yeah, maybe the scaffolding and platforms will adapt to show that conspicuous consumption.
You just reminded me that there's a Rolls-Royce social network, which is basically you get invited to if you buy a Rolls-Royce, and that's basically it. And it is a proper social network. It's not just like a club for people who've got a Rolls-Royce. It's like a kind of a mini Facebook with lots of features, all of that for networking among other Rolls-Royce owners. So yes, I think some of those are fascinating in terms of what they do and how they exist. So
I did read.
Yep, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say I did read something interesting recently about super yachts, and this sort of very kind of tiny group of individuals who buy these multi-billion-dollar super yachts and kit them out with helipads and every luxury. And apparently there's quite an issue because the only people who really recognise the value of these super yachts are other super yacht owners. So sort of this kind of ladder of people sticking kind of basically crazy things onto their super yachts in order to show the rest of us that actually they are super wealthy, which seems somewhat comical, but so it goes.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Between like letting the whole world know you're rich and just being in a club so that other people in that club know that you're in the club. You know, like with watches, for example, most people don't know what's a really, really expensive watch and what's a cheap watch, but other people who know about it will know. So there's a kind of interesting sort of social element to that. Just one last thing. I'm really interested in equality around things like how money works. And so obviously there's a lot that you've seen about the fact that contactless and everything moving to cards and moving away from a cash economy has quite an impact on equality and access to finance, because obviously you've got to have a bank account first of all. So do you think things are getting less equal as this progresses, or do you think there's there's things that are changing maybe around making some of those things more accessible to people? I just think it's a huge shift that people maybe aren't talking about as much. I think about it when I see people who are homeless and asking for money, and you think, well, I don't even carry money anymore. So what does that mean even for that part of the economy? I don't know if you had anybody had any thoughts on that.
I mean, just to kick off, it feels to me that it's both of those things, probably. So just anecdotally, I've got teenage kids, and I can see the apps and so on that they use for banking are actually kind of quite helpful, because they can kind of budget, and it's all at their fingertips. It's with the device that's always with them. And actually the banks, some of them, well, I'm sure they're not all like this, but some of them seem to be putting mechanisms in place so that young people don't overspend, and that they're living within their means, and so on and so forth. They can save and all the rest of it. At the other end of the scale, I've got older parents who are never going to use digital for banking. They're just about to email, and booking a holiday is online is cause for a family celebration. So it seems like it's both of those things, probably. It's quite interesting looking. I've done a bit of work with the charity sector and sort of transforming charities to being more kind of digital first organizations. And it's really interesting seeing how, on the street, collection has adapted to more contactless with, virtual tins, where you can swipe them, and even, people saying the big issue, I've seen people in London with, a little adaptation to their phone so that you can buy a big issue with your contactless card. I mean, that's got to be a good thing. Although I don't know. I mean, are the banks skimming off, 0.75% of every transaction, probably?
Yeah, no, I guess there's still a. I mean, charities and that. I mean, obviously the big issue is a big organization, relatively speaking, compared to ordinary people, and so they've got the infrastructure to be able to do that. I suppose. I guess maybe it's just that kind of the group of people who don't even have access to those things, like even a phone or smartphone or being part of an organization, that are probably going to be hit the most, and I guess they were already hit the hardest anyway in as the economy as it was. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts or comments on any of that.
Yeah, I moved to Finland 2 years ago, and that was one of the things I noticed right away is this cashless economy. Before COVID, that just everything is by card or phone, and I wondered the same thing. It's like who's left out here, who doesn't have a bank account, or people. I mean, there's not a lot of homeless people here, so it's not as apparent. But there's something I wondered about too. But listening to your talk, James, I was thinking that would make a great design project or art project. The way you've set this up, of like, how do we the screaming bank card, or something that reveals what's happening when that card goes in the machine, all the connections and chains of actions it sets off. It would make a really nice project. How do you visualize that?
Yeah, I'd love to do something in that area. Actually, I think the sort of thought behind that really was a few years ago, when in the UK we had was quite a few years ago now, the rollout of the Oyster card network, and people were sort of putting their Oyster cards into a solvent and extracting the chip, and somebody created Oyster card coloured nails, you know, and somebody had like a little fingernail so that they could sort of touch in and out, which I thought was brilliant. And somebody else put it into a Doctor Who sonic screwdriver toy so that they could kind of live the fantasy of, buzzing through the, you know, the turnstiles. So I quite like that sort of hacking, that kind of imaginative, you know, hacking of all this stuff that we're given and told not to break and not to open, you know.
I also think that is interesting about thinking about just touch points with the economy generally, and the fact that how strong a touch point the bank card is, but the fact that, you know, you were talking about the example of, you know, teenagers having access to kind of more information about their own budgeting and their own banking, and how that was, which is really on a personal level really, really useful, but on a collective level, you know, these bank cards actually kind of hide more away, don't they? I mean, I think, you know, things like a cash economy, we've become more aware of. It feels like we're more aware of how everybody else participates in that economy. And when we have our own kind of cards and personalized systems, maybe we're just less aware of how the economy functions than we were before, which is already pretty unaware, to be honest. So I think, yeah, this is interesting what you're saying, Elise, as well, about these kind of, yeah, sort of these touch points with the economy, but actually other ways of exploring that through kind of design.
I mean, just anecdotally, my older parents found out recently that they were spending £90 a month for home broadband, you know, and they weren't getting paper bills anymore. You know, they weren't sort of seeing the account details. And I think probably what happened was years ago they signed up to you know, to BT, and you know, they came out of contract and BT put some massive charge on. They were absolutely horrified. And you could say, well, they should have been checking their bank statements every month, but you know, they're two older people using Wi-Fi basically for sending emails and browsing the internet, and they were spending £90, you know, every single month. So yeah, totally hidden from them, you know, that they're sort of those kind of transactions. And I guess in other areas of work and life, I'm interested in data and the sort of analysis of data and what that kind of, how that can kind of help us. And you do wonder what's happening with all this data. I mean, it is our data. There's that whole kind of stuff around data ownership and the kind of public service notions around data and data ownership. And it feels like there's not a lot checking or balancing all of this data that we're kind of ploughing sort of out there for banks and everyone else to take advantage of. So yeah.
There was a social network, and it may have been a long time ago now, maybe even like 10 years ago, and I don't remember what it was called, and I don't know how long it was around, but the idea of it, and maybe it's still around, the idea of it was to have a social network for all of your spending, which I found really, really interesting. So effectively, everything that you purchased would be public. You would basically share all the things that you were buying through this social network. And on the first hand, it kind of seems really like, wow, I mean, I really, really wouldn't want to do that. But I think that kind of extreme openness deliberately with other people was quite fascinating. You know, like you say, a lot of this data is just going and being, we don't know where it goes. We don't know what people are doing with it. So the idea of consciously sharing stuff really, really openly is quite an interesting act in the face of all that as well.
Mm. I mean, some businesses are opening up a bit, aren't they? With you know, they're being forced to open up about sort of what they're paying, you know, company directors, and you know, and I've got some friends who run a cooperative business, a technology cooperative, and they're really interesting. They've done an awful lot of work to think about sort of how they run sociocratically. So they have these kind of governing circles, and it's all, you know, everyone is sort of either in the center, a kind of a member of the co-op, or they're in the kind of rings around it. And they decided to make a public commitment to never pay anybody any more than 3 times what the lowest paid person gets paid in the company, and that person is in fact the cleaner. So there's just a kind of, that's how it works, you know. And if you want to join the cooperative and add your labor to the mix, then that's one of the considerations you've got to take on board before you choose to join. It's really nice, I think.
No, I agree. Sorry, Beverly's got a question as well, actually. Go for it, Beverly.
Thank you. Just wanted to pick up on 2 points that you mentioned, James. You mentioned your children and the app, which sounds lovely, but at the same time, then they're tied into that particular bank. So we often shouldn't sort of mistake sort of clever marketing for altruism, really. And also that links into your other point about the leaded credit card, which ideally from our perspective would be good for us, but the bank would most probably make it as light as a feather, because people who sort of get lots and lots of debt are actually their best customers, so they wouldn't. So I think it's interesting to think of the 2 points, both from our perspective, what's good for us, but equally to think that the banks are driven by self-interest and survival. So that was just my point.
I'm certain you're right. I mean, they're definitely not altruistic, and I'm sure they're loving the fact. I mean, not the pandemic, but the fact that we are all being forced to pay contactlessly. I mean, I think the story goes that the whole cashback thing from years and years ago. I remember my old boss telling me this. Shops were finding that having cash, in the store was expensive to them, because they had to pay, companies to cart this stuff away, and security vans and security staff and all the rest of it. So somebody kind of came up with the idea of what would it be like if we kind of gave the cash back to the customers, because they're coming into the shop and then they're going around the corner to the cash point, so we could just give them some of this cash, and we sell it to them on the basis that this is a great service that we're offering to you, but really it was about saving those stores money. So that's always going to be the bottom line, isn't it? Literally, I suppose.
Is there a lot of discussion about what the banks are doing with our data? I mean, I know we hear it a lot with the software and social media, et cetera, but is there discussion about what banks are doing with our data? I don't hear it too much.
Personally, no. The only banking data stuff that I'm particularly aware of, because I work with open data, is things like open banking API stuff, which is about just your ability to access banking data from different providers. So it's easier to aggregate. For example, if I built an app now, I might find it easier to aggregate data from your different banking systems that you're using than I would have done previously when it was more locked down. But I'm not the banking data expert at all. So I'm not sure. I don't think there's a lot of discussion around what happens with that. It's much more a social network thing, isn't it? We think about what happens with our data with Facebook, but we don't think about what happens with our data with banking. So no, I'm not aware of that particularly.
I mean, I can see some of it coming back to me in the form of apps from the bank that say, okay, this month you spent X percentage on these categories of expenditures, but how they compare me to other consumers and what they do with the big data, I'd be really interested to know.
It sounds like a similar discussion to the health discussion with data about what you keep for yourself and what you think is of benefit to the community. I think that's a similar thing. It'd be worth having that discussion for sure.
We need some insiders from a bank to tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I did a project a few years ago for a client, and they wanted basically a sort of a piece of journalism wrapped into a game experience. So we came up with an app called Data Mine, and you role played a probationary data broker. And the idea, the conceit was that you were trying to get this job, and the game communicated to you in the form of text messages. And you were given a data set, and you had to make certain choices about that data, how you improved it, how you triangulated it with other data sources, in order to see the value of the data going up. And in the course of doing that, as a person, you were learning something about data brokerage and the value of our data to these individuals. And it was really, I found it really interesting, because I learned a lot about data and the data sets that are out there, and purchasable for pretty tiny amounts of money. And it's sort of nominally being cleaned up, but it hasn't really. It's very easy to point two data sets together and find out, who it is that's using the alcohol and drug dependency services in a particular city. And the other thing that was really interesting, it's become a bit of a kind of legendary story, but there was a woman in America who basically found out that she was pregnant through getting supermarket vouchers, through the mail, because the data sort of signatures of various interactions in her life had pointed together, and some computer somewhere had said, oh, this individual is expecting a baby, we'll send her some vouchers for whatever, before she even knew that she was expecting a baby, which is just, that's pretty accurate, pointy stuff, and that's obviously in the world of retail. So you kind of wonder what the world of banking must be like. It's probably been, weaponized, I should think.
Yeah, actually, even at small scale, that sort of data pattern stuff can be hugely illuminating. I think I remember going along to a talk with some people who are working in housing associations a few years ago, and they were talking about the fact that they're capturing data across all of their properties. And one of the things they discovered early on was that there was a classic set of repairs that needed doing that indicated domestic abuse. In other words, you could basically look at your properties, you could say, these things are getting broken in the house, there is domestic abuse. And even that's like a small set of data. So it's really interesting when you scale up just how much that provides you with. Andre's got a question.
Yeah, I was just wanted to get the perspective of I don't think the banks are mostly concerned about data for the purposes of selling them. I think they want them themselves for more on what investments are good, or more about the money aspect of it. I think direct use and more what could they invest in. And also I think customers are more concerned about how their banks are using their money, which is kind of more direct than the data as well. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, there's not a huge amount of openness, is there, about where these investments are? There've been various scandals in the UK over the last number of years about, faith organisations, for instance, revealing that they have big investments via pension funds in, institutions and companies that they, wouldn't immediately spring to mind. I think the Church of England had big investments in BAE, the big weapons manufacturer. So, not particularly a good thing, perhaps.
I just put a website in the chat, which allows you to search for banks and what they invest in.
Oh, interesting.
According to sustainability criteria, effectively. I've done all my banks through it. It's quite illuminating.
Yeah.
But yeah, I actually bank with Monzo, and they seem to do all right. But yeah, it's interesting. I just discovered it a few days ago, and I meant to try and remember what it was, and just found it again.
Thanks. Has anyone got any more questions or points to make?
No, I haven't. I mean, I just, sorry if anybody, yes, Elise.
Just a different track, but what your original point about access and the bank card or credit card giving you access was making me think about, we had a speaker here this year, Mahmoud Kashbarts from Sweden, who does a thing about the design of the passport, and just all the design that goes into a passport and how that controls who has access to what and to where, and is a fascinating sort of expose of thinking about this thing as a physical thing that gives so much entitlement and access that goes with that passport. And then that inspired a student to think about in her life what a Metro card gives access to and who can have what category of Metro card. And it's just kind of a nice thing, such a small thing, but means so much.